everyone. It's 4 o'clock in the East. In covering a presidency that is every single day summed up by its unprecedented and unparalleled combination of callousness, incompetence, and surrealness, Donald Trump and his administration have managed to outdo themselves today, likely endangering national security, his own staff, and the journalists whose job it is to cover all of them in the process. Alarming new reporting finds that Donald Trump used his own staff and White House journalists as decoys amid security threats from Iran, having them fly out of Turkey on the old Air Force One while Donald Trump flew out on a separate unmarked aircraft. Donald Trump pulled this off by being smuggled in a catering truck, if you can just let your brain try to picture that, to his separate unmarked aircraft. Washington Post, who broke this news, reports this, quote, Trump boarded the old Air Force One jumbo jet in view of the television cameras. He was secretly shuttled minutes later to a smaller plane, an Air Force C-32A, via an airport catering truck typically used to load meals and other supplies pre-flight, according to a U.S. official and corroborating material reviewed by the Post. That made Air Force One a decoy, with media and some White House staff aboard. The maneuver meant that Trump's actual location was concealed from the American public and many senior U.S. officials for hours. Weeks later, it remains unclear how widely the administration has disclosed the operation. The Washington Post found pool footage showing Donald Trump boarding Air Force One. The catering truck then pulls up to the plane and moves over to what we now know was the plane Trump ended up departing Turkey on board. Both planes then landed in the UK, and Trump was then secretly moved back onto the old Air Force One to keep up the ruse. He then disembarked in full view of reporters and boarded his Qatari-donated Air Force One, the big fancy one, to return to Washington. At the time, it was reported that Trump would be leaving Turkey on the old Air Force One rather than the Qatari Air Force One due to security threats from Iran. What is new here is that we're now learning for the first time that Trump flew on neither aircraft. In fact, he departed on the third plane. Trump vehemently denied the reporting about the reasons behind the first switch that we know about at the time when pressed by reporters on the ride back to Washington. Reporters who were unaware they had just been used as decoys by the President of the United States. Watch that with this new information in mind.
We sent this one in so that the Air Force Base here was in the same exact line.
Do you think there wasn't a security concern?
Well, yeah, because you're, probably on a dangerous flight because of the sleaze bags that we have to do.
Thinking that Iran was possibly thinking
I mean, if they asked you to close your windows, probably different. They didn't ask me to close mine, but if they did, I would have done it. Now, these are sick people, so I can see something like that. I didn't know they did that, but I can see something.
Were you aware of any credible threat by Iran against their island?
I'm number one on their list before you. But if I go, you go. Right?
What was their
So
specific
perhaps someday want to change professions.
If I go, you go. When he said it, you knew it wasn't true, right? He'd just been shuttled off the plane that the press he's talking to right there were on. So when he says, quote, if I go, you go, he knows he's lying. An elaborate fabrication. A lot of unnecessary steps there taken to sustain the lie. In a statement to the New York Times, the White House said, quote, they use every tool at our disposal, including distraction and misdirection, to address threats against the president. Donald Trump engaging in an extraordinary act of deception is the latest proof that he's lost complete control of the war with Iran, is where we begin today. With New York Times White House correspondent Maggie Haberman. She's the author of the bombshell bestseller, Regime Change. She confirmed the operation for the Times after the Washington Post first broke this story. She also is one of the journalists who first reported about the security threat and one of the reasons we know about it. Also joining us, Ned Price is here. He served as an official in both the State Department and the CIA. And with me for the hour, former Assistant Special Agent in charge at the FBI, National Security and Intelligence Analyst Michael Feinberg's here. Maggie, just untangle this web of perhaps a legitimate security threat. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And then a rather unparalleled deception involving White House staff and press. And oh, by the way, subpoenas for 5 New York Times journalists in the middle of all this. Just unwind and unpack all that for us.
Let me put it that way, Paul. Thank you for having me. And it is my colleagues and I confirmed what was pretty astonishing reporting from the Washington Post, and we tip our hat to them. But yes, what looked like one thing at the time, a president taking an older Air Force One, for old time's sake, in his words, the press only knew about this, the public only knew about that, because he announced that he was doing it. And then they got questions. And then the White House communications director gave that statement about doing everything they can to protect the president, including misdirection and or distractions and misdirections, which was a little strange. Then it turned out that, within 24 hours, the New York Times is reporting about the fact that there had been a concern by government officials about the president taking the Qatari gifted jet, which does not have the same defensive capabilities as the older Air Force One models. The reporters on the story, my colleagues, faced subpoenas, not subpoenas that were delivered through counsel, but FBI showing up at people's homes, which is not normally how this is done, and subpoenas are not supposed to be the very first stop on the road in leak investigations. Those subpoenas don't exist anymore, but what now turns out is that the president wasn't even on that plane. Now, our reporting is that there was a credible threat. We don't know what the threat was, Nicole, so, it's hard for me to assess what I don't know. I'm not an intel official. They deemed it credible, and, that there is reason to believe that they did. Their behavior indicates that they did. But what then ends up happening is, and they are always going to put the president's safety first, what ends up happening is the press and some of his own staff end up on the older Air Force One, which does have defensive capabilities, which certainly would be safer than the Qatari jet in that moment. The president could have, in that clip that you showed, where he was briefing reporters on the Qatari jet that they got aboard and was flying from the UK base, which was deemed safer than the Ankara airport in Turkey, flying back to the US, to Joint Base Andrews, he could have said, we had a concern, we had a threat, I was on a separate plane. He could have told reporters off the record. The White House could have told reporters off the record. None of that happened. Instead, there is this gamesmanship where he's sort of taunting and saying, if I go, you go. And that was not the case in that moment. Again, I want to stress, I understand the federal government is rightly going to be more worried about the president than it is anybody else, but there are trade-offs, and that was one of them.
Maggie, do you now think that the subpoenas were to find out if you guys knew where he really was, or if they were to ascertain, does it make you wonder what the subpoenas were for in the first place?
It's a good question, and I can't say that I fully understand it. The Times was not the only outlet that reported some of this material at the time. Maybe there were subpoenas to other news outlets and we weren't aware of them. I don't know, but it mostly seemed to be, from my understanding, and again, maybe there is more here, clearly there's always a lot more that we don't know when it comes to this particular government, but they are very good at creating these displays of openness. Jonathan and I wrote about this in Regime Change, and in fact, it's just a show, it's a spectacle. They're very good at keeping secrets when they want to, and this was one they tried to, but I don't know if the secret they were attempting to keep was this, or if they were just generally trying to intimidate from further reporting in general. We know that this president likes secrecy and does not like information getting out of his government unless he sanctions it. So it could be, answer D, all of the above. I don't know.
And Maggie, I was on the other side of the relationship, but I can't imagine a situation where you do not level up with the White House pool and the White House press corps that travels with you. Obviously on September 11th, it was an extraordinary event, and not all the press went on with President Bush. He ended up in Nebraska, but they were not used as a decoy, one, and they were made aware of what was happening and why. So both the security threat, that the towers had been hit, the Pentagon had been hit, and there was an obvious threat to the president, and the fact that we weren't going to send them up in a plane so that whoever was attacking the country that day thought the president of the United States was on it when he wasn't. I cannot fathom that practice. And I wonder if it makes you rethink, or your colleagues rethink, the relationship with this White House.
I think we're pretty clear that this White House doesn't like the press, and beyond that, does not really think much of the public's right to know, and doesn't see the press as anything more than a means to an end for what President Trump personally wants. And I don't think that that is new here. I think that that has been pretty consistent the whole time for this presidency. I think in the first term, I think you did have people who at least recognized some role of what government is supposed to do, and they do at times have that. I don't want to suggest that this relates to every single thing. Not everything is completely binary. But in this instance, and there have been others, to your point, it's not unheard of that there would be some kind of subterfuge involved to try to keep a president safe. But presidents, to your point, President Bush traveled with reporters, albeit a slimmed down press pool, after 9/11. Presidents have taken reporters with them, including this president in his first term, into war zones. Reporters end up making an agreement beyond the understanding of good faith with White Houses that we will keep this off the record until we land or until we're in a specific spot. And then the public is informed. What this speaks to is this broader idea of secrecy, which is a huge hallmark of this government, in a way that I personally have never seen with the federal government, or frankly any other.
Ned, let me pull you in, because you had a job more recently than I had a job in sort of whether you liked what the press was reporting about your boss or not. When they travel with a principal, you are, Maggie used the word good faith, but you are bound to sort of return them safely, and or at a minimum be transparent when there are threats. But this putting the second Air Force One into the sky as a decoy, and then the elaborate, Donald Trump is someone who refused to go to a cemetery when it was raining because he didn't want to mess up his hair, and the thought of him climbing into a catering truck, suggests that the threat was real. And we don't have any reason to doubt that. And it is also true that if it was that real, that he switched planes twice and climbed into a catering truck, the press and the staff had a right to know about it.
Absolutely, Nicole. Look, both when I was working at the White House and more recently the State Department, we would always tell our traveling press corps that, look, there may be tension in this relationship, there may be occasional acrimony, but we're part of the family. You're part of the family. We're responsible for your safety and your security when you're traveling with us, whether that's to cover the President, the Secretary of State, or anyone else. And listening to both you and to Maggie talk about what transpired on the way back from that summit, I'm reminded of a sort of set of Russian nesting dolls of lies. It was a lie inside of a lie, inside of a lie, starting with what struck so many of us as odd at the time, the idea that President Trump would fly back on the Legacy Air Force One so that the troops in the UK could gaze up at the splendor and majesty of the gift he had just received from the royal family in Qatar. That didn't sound like this president, but so be it. And there were subsequent lies, of course, the threat reporting regarding Iran, the fact that he traveled on this other military jet. But the lie that I cannot get over has been what really amounts to a weeks-long deception campaign that has also been targeted at the American people. Up until last night, and even to this very moment, even though they have suggested it after the Washington Post came out with this, the White House has still not said, has not been transparent about how and why the president traveled back from that summit in Turkey. Nicole, you know this well. There is a way to protect the President of the United States, other senior government officials, in a way that is consistent with longstanding norms, including the relationship with the press, and also our democratic charter that calls for an informed citizenry, cognizant of what our senior-most officials are up to. You did it on 9/11. You did it when President George W. Bush traveled to Iraq for the first time on Thanksgiving in 2003, just months after the invasion. I was part of it with President Obama when he went to war zones. President Biden went to Ukraine. Just as Maggie said, you go to extraordinary measures. But what you don't do, you don't lie to the reporters, and you don't use them as unwitting pawns to propagate the secession campaign against the American people. That, Nicole, I think is just unforgivable.
Well, and Michael Feinberg, you don't then subpoena 5 journalists who get close. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around the timeline here. So Trump goes back to Air Force One and lies immediately after pulling off what he must have thought was a great scam, right? And again, I will not impugn the motive behind it, right? They had to protect him. We'll stipulate that. But then to wave to reporters like you were aboard the original Air Force One, and then to go to the back of the plane and say, if I go, you go. Like, to put that much effort into telling the lie to reporters who could very easily have been taken off the record and would not have betrayed that confidence, is a new piece of information that, or it looks new. I guess we had that tape at the time. But the second is, why were those 5 journalists subpoenaed in your view?
I honestly don't know. It's very difficult to say. This new information complicates every discussion we've had about the subpoenas since we first learned they were issued. You know, I used to investigate this sort of stuff for a living. I am a bit more forgiving of media subpoenas, I suspect, than anybody else on this panel or anybody else in our audience, quite frankly. But the timing does look suspicious. If there was a legitimate loss of national security information, it would seem that there is a legitimate reason at some point to issue subpoenas in an investigation to find out how it was released. But as far as we know, these subpoenas were still issued just because the White House got embarrassed at the New York Times' reporting. We know this because it was reported on MS Now that Kash Patel was called back to the White House as he was leaving town to take charge of the leak investigation himself. Now, that was a bad idea 6 ways from Sundays, which we can get into if you want, but this whole thing, the whole national security apparatus of the United States right now is frankly a clown show. And I think looking for rational explanations for why any given step is taken is a little bit of a fool's errand. I'm probably the only person on this panel who would defend what the White House did in this particular set of circumstances with the decoy, but that doesn't mean I'm going to defend the ham-fisted way in which Trump got in the press pool and started just mouthing off in the narcissistic way he normally does about how he's the center of the universe and anything that happens to him happens to everybody. There's just an element of maturity and sobriety that every other president in the history of the United States has had that he lacks. And we can psychoanalyze why that is, but if I was a reporter in his press pool, I wouldn't be giving any credence to a single word that comes out of his mouth.
Yeah, I mean, Maggie, do you think this changes the relationship? I think you're more clear-eyed than most. You've been covering him longer than most. But do you think this changes the relationship between the president and the press that travels with him and covers him?
I think the relationship between the president and the mainstream press in this term is already pretty bad. And it is largely because this president has used a number of different tools to engage in a bullying campaign across industries. Again, something Jonathan and I write about in our book, but one of them is media. And he has used an outside effort, which is suing different outlets, and he has used levers of government power to try to impose, some kinds of constraints on various media. We're still seeing that happen. And so I don't think that there is anybody who's especially surprised that President Trump and a lot of his aides don't love the media. They've already taken control of the White House press pool. The way the press pool is made up is very different than it was when you were there, Nicole, or when I was there in term one. It is a fundamentally different thing. But what I do wonder is whether this gives pause in general to outlets that have been excited to be on Air Force One, aren't part of the rotation that often, but are paying to be part of the pool this time because outlets do have to pay. They pay their rate to travel. I just don't know, but I think it is really hard. You hit on the issue that I think is complicated here, or not even complicated, but is the main underscore, which is the credibility gap. There is, if you are not honest about any of this, if you engage in this deception, which again, as I said earlier, there are trade-offs to protect a president. We do understand that. But if you do this and you are not at all candid with the reporters who are traveling aboard, You don't tell them at the beginning. You don't let them know and ask off the record. You don't tell them once you're safe and let them know. Then it makes it very hard when you are telling lies about matters big and small to get, any kind of credibility and to have people believe you. The main one that's happening with right now is the Iran war, where the president continues to insist all is going well and the U.S. has plenty of munitions. That's just not true. But again, it goes back to the point of what he thinks the public has a right to know. There are fewer and fewer opportunities to ask him questions, to ask Caroline Levitt questions, to ask the Pentagon questions. And none of that helps an informed public.
Yeah, I mean, I have to take a break, but I want to press all of you on what is underneath all, I think, of the attacks on the press, which is the fear of the truth seeping out. Now, Ron already knows it, but I think Trump thinks he can keep his hardened base of supporters from finding out that most national security officials think we are either losing or have lost the war with Iran. We'll have that conversation next. Also ahead for us, Trump's new attorney general got right to work yesterday using every bit of power he has to shield Donald Trump from accountability from just about anything he does or says on the job. What Blanche's first act would do to keep private and away from congressional scrutiny. We'll bring you that reporting. Plus, the same Justice Department hopes to make life very, very difficult for one American, despite Jeanine Pirro's big box of evidence suggesting that American did nothing wrong. We'll try to explain. And later, more on our top story, that very credible threat to the president's safety and the means that the White House went to keep it all under wraps. Former CIA Director John Brennan joins our coverage, and the Washington Post reporter who was first to report this news last night. We'll get to all that and much more. And Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
That you're leaving Ankara not in the new Air Force One because of security concerns involving Iran. You've spoken today twice about them possibly assassinating you and possibly being successful. Did that concern have something to do with it?
Well, I speak about it a lot because, the life of a president is very dangerous. It's a very dangerous profession. No, I'm number one on the kill list for Iran. They're lovely people. I'm number one.
We're back with Maggie, Ned, and Michael Feinberg. Ned, what's so jarring is and I guess people that have covered him forever are accustomed to this, but the weaving of lies with things that are true enough, right? I mean, he is, because of the Soleimani hit in his first term, he is targeted by Iran, and because of this war, I'm sure the threats are more acute, but so were Mike Pompeo and Mark Milley and all these other people who he took security away from. It is this dissonance that I think all this reporting has revealed from Trump himself.
Nicole, one of the many takeaways from this reporting, for me at least, is the casual way in which this White House lies to their audiences, including, most importantly, to the American people, on things both small, minute, trivial, but also very, very big. They have a tortured relationship with the truth across the board. Think about this for a second, Nicole. Imagine a world in which the White House just went out and essentially told the truth. And they handled a situation like this in a way that their predecessors did. They brought in a small press pool, maybe they confiscated their phones, they say the president's going to do this, you'll come with him, you can report when it's all said and done. It might have been a story for a day. But instead, they chose to engage in this deceit and this subterfuge, and now they're facing a firestorm. And one of the ironies that I couldn't help but think about is that the reporting from the New York Times that landed them in such hot water with these subpoenas, it was all predicated on a lie, actually. All these outlets focused on the safety features of the new Air Force One, the gift from the royal family of Qatar, because we were all under the impression that the president had to fly Legacy Air Force One because he couldn't fly that Air Force One, and in fact, that wasn't true. So picture this Earth 2, where the White House had been truthful all along. They would not have had to contend with all these stories about the new Air Force One. It would have been a story that the president had to engage in these extraordinary security tactics. But I think people would be understanding because we all wouldn't have been victim to this deception campaign ourselves.
Yeah, let me read you, Michael Feinberg, especially with your sort of unique perspective on national security issues, and not sort of being in the press or having it to be your top priority to protect the press. Let me present this to you from the Washington Post. Because the press was seemingly in the dark about the operation, Garrett Graff, a journalist and historian, said that the event that is probably unprecedented in modern presidential history, that the White House would lie to the press corps in its entirety about where the president is. That is a new Rubicon that's being crossed. The breach was not merely one of journalistic access, according to Graff, knowing that this was a series of actions that the White House and the military took precisely because of a threat that they were deeply worried about makes it all the more egregious that the press was kept out of the loop, he added. Now, there is a thing that I think people spent decades trying to understand, and that's, this relationship to the press when you're covering someone who is threatened. Sometimes that closeness to the threat, outsiders, I think, believe can make you less objective. My point being that it might have benefited the White House and the president if the press knew just how grave the threat was. They always do the wrong thing times 10. And I wonder your thoughts on this now very public example, not just endangering the White House staff and the White House press by putting them on a decoy plane, but what looks like a very elaborate effort. And we don't even know. I mean, this is really sort of day 0 plus 12 hours. We don't even know what they'll do to try to hunt down the source of the story we're talking about now.
Yeah, so I could actually hypothesize a situation where this all makes sense and through which we could defend what the Trump administration did. And that would be if the way that they got the information about the threat to Air Force One and about the threat to Trump was an ongoing, continuous stream of reporting of some sort that they had to protect long after this flight because of ongoing value to U.S. national security interests. Now, that would justify not briefing the press after the plane had touched down. It would justify not telling them anything off the record. It would be well within the norms of national security work. But the fundamental problem is that, as the other panelists have brought up, and as Maggie has documented time and time again, this is an administration and a person who lies as if it is as natural as breathing air. So we can't grant any of them the benefit of the doubt or look at things under the light most favorable to them simply because they've never given us a reason to trust them.
Yeah. Maggie, quickly, there's a little detail in your reporting that I want to ask you about. You write a pool report noted as the plane took off, quote, "We've been advised to keep our window shades in the press cabin closed." Do you know if that was for security or so that no one would see him in this catering cart?
I believe, based on our reporting, that it was the latter, Nicole. And that night, when that full report came in, it really stayed with me. I said something about it publicly that night. I've talked about it with other people. At the time, it seemed like it was an indicator that there was a serious threat because, as you know, when planes fly into, say, war zones, presidential aircraft, the window shades come down, and it's so that they're not targeted. Mm-hmm. So, if anything, it seemed like it was, underscoring what kind of a threat this might have been, and that might be the case, but I don't believe that that is why the window shades were down. I think the window shades were down so that the reporters could not see the catering containers moving away. Because if you look at that picture showing, the press cabin is at the back. I mean, you know this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The press cabin is at the back of the plane on the right-hand side, nearish where that second container is. But it would be very hard for the president to have walked to that container because he would have been seen. So I think this was just to keep anybody from peering out the window as this was all taking place.
Right. It's also a lot of luggage and food to load to the front of the plane, which is really just where, right? Like that, it just wouldn't go there. And folks that travel with the president know that. It would be
the kitchen's in the back of the plane. So, yeah.
Correct. And the only passengers up there are the pilots and the president. So it's a lot of stuff to put right there. Endlessly interesting, and we're so glad we got to talk to you, Maggie, and to you, Ned. Thank you so much for joining us today.